In this class, we're going to talk about performance measures and look at some of the various metrics that are used in order to measure the extent to which a business has achieved its objectives. So there are steps in the measurement system that we need to deal with, we need to be familiar with, and we need to know their significance. For a start, the company will probably have a strategic plan, and the strategic plan will itemize where the company wants to be, let's say in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And that may be reflected in its mission statement. A mission statement is normally a short statement which is appended to its final accounts, or it could be on its website or on other material. But the mission statement is aspirational. It says where the business is and what it wants to be in the future. So it's setting up an objective. It's setting up a direction for the business. The business wishes to travel. It tells the reader how the business wants to be perceived. Now, in order to achieve its mission, it must identify key result areas, because parts of the business will have to change, will have to be restructured, or will have to be altered perhaps. So it needs to identify the key result areas, and then measurements should be taken to see where the business is now, how the business is doing, what's been achieved at the moment, and then compare that to what is required in the future if it's going to meet its mission in the future. So look at the adjustments that have to take place. The business is currently structured in a certain way. It currently makes products in a certain way. It's got management of a certain type. It's got certain attributes which we can identify by just looking at the organization and studying the organization as it is now. But the business actually wants to be somewhere else in the future. It wants to meet its mission statement requirements. And in order to do that, measurements should be taken. Measurements which will indicate to the business what is needed, what is required in order to move it from its current position to where it wants to be in the future. So it's important to identify the key result areas, identify the core activities, the important issues, and deal with these and get them structured and get them moving in a direction which will enable it to hit its mission objectives down the line. Our first step in developing measures is to reflect the goal. Now, our first steps in measuring this is to reflect the goal in a way which dissects it or breaks it into its input and output dimensions. So the company is aiming for a particular structure, a particular orientation in the future, which is written into its mission statement. This is what the mission statement is telling the world. This is what the company wants to do, and this is how the company wants to be seen. So in a sense, those are the outputs. Those are the goals of the business. That's how it wants to be judged in the future. So we can break down that goal into its input and output dimensions. Because quintessentially, companies simply take in inputs, transform the inputs into outputs. So the company takes in resources at one end, processes the resources, and makes an outcome. So in looking at the goal the mission statement is setting up, the goal that where the company wants to be in, let's say, 10 years' time, we need to look at the inputs and the outputs, because the company, in a sense, fits in between. The company is the mechanism, the organization the company is in between the inputs and the outputs. The company is the institution that transforms the inputs into the outputs. So what we need to do is to dissect the goal into its input and output dimensions, to break it up into its input and output dimensions. So that's our step one. That's what we're going to look into. It's our first step in this particular video. Now, the broad measurement concepts of inputs. We have the unit cost efficiency. This is an input dimension, the unit cost efficiency. How well are materials used? So the organization needs to look at the efficiency with which it uses its inputs. So it needs to look at the efficiency with which it uses its inputs and assess from there whether economies and savings can be made. So how well is labour used? Or are workers standing around waiting? Or is the production process designed in a way that it's not smoothly fitting together? There's no sort of sequential system that runs smoothly from one to the next. Are there gaps? Are there waiting times? Are there issues in production? So how effective are inputs used? How are the overheads used? Are the overheads fully utilized? Or are parts of the business just standing idle? Does it have excessive floor space that's not being used? That's an overhead. It has to be paid for. So to what extent is the business efficient? That's an input dimension. The output dimensions, well, we can break the output dimensions into internal results and external results. So we can imagine output as in two parts, internal and external. Let's look at the internal results. This could be something like maintaining and improving quality. That's an output dimension. So to what extent is the business maintaining and improving its quality? Because the output from the business is perhaps in quantitative terms. We can count them up. They're physical, quantitative things that are being produced, products that are being produced. But the product is more than just simply an entity. The product has a certain quality. It must have the capacity to meet customer requirements. This product has to be sold. So it has to go to another place where it will be sold, and it must enable the customers, the buyers of the product, to receive a benefit. That's their motivation in purchasing. So there's an output dimension. The lower consumer prices might be taken as a part of the internal results. If the business is efficient in doing what it does, then lower consumer prices may be the result. The company may have the capacity to reduce its consumer prices. This might be done for all sorts of reasons, mind you. It could be done for strategic reasons. It might be done to gain competitive advantage. It might be done to stop entry, stop other companies from coming in. So there may be all sorts of motives for reducing the prices. But lowering consumer prices and the capacity to lower consumer prices may be a reflection of improving efficiency within the organization. And we can see that as an internal result. It's an output dimension, but it's related to the internal workings of the business, as is maintaining, improving quality, lowering consumer prices. We also have, on the external results, we have the financial returns. The business must produce financial returns for legal reasons, for tax reasons. But also, the financial returns are good indicators of the overall performance of the business. Not only can the business reflect on its own set of accounts and account for its own ups and downs in the accounts, but it can be used for a basis for comparison. Perhaps ratios can be calculated from the financial returns, and these ratios can then be compared to industry standards if they are known, or they can be compared with perhaps larger competitors who publish their accounts. So the company can position itself in terms of its effectiveness according to those ratios. It knows where it is positioned. It knows how successful it is compared to others. And that may be a driving force for more effort in terms of looking for efficiencies and looking for cost savings and better running the business. So financial returns have a managerial impact. They're not just simply reporting how the business did at the end of the year. So they could be used, for example, to improve market share, but market share itself may be driven by other factors. It may be driven by management who simply, without reference even to the financial accounts, simply know that the market's becoming more competitive. The feedback from the marketing department may indicate that the market is becoming more competitive and that their competitors are becoming more aggressive and more pervasive in the market and more proactive. And that means that management must spring into action and must try to counter this by having quite aggressive campaigns themselves to try and improve their market share, to try to maintain their position in the market so that they don't get overwhelmed by the efforts of their competitors. It's important that the business, of course, meets its current and future demand. It would be futile on the part of marketing to go into the marketplace, to meet customers, to make promises, and then the company cannot meet those promises. So it must meet the current demand and the future demand. It must anticipate what the market will be in 6 months or a year's time and try to ensure that it can meet the likely demands at that time. So these are external results related to the output dimension. Now let's move to step 2. Develop output measures for each goal. So we're going to try and develop output measures for each goal. For a start, outputs are accomplishments. Those are achievements of the business. Outcomes are what the business are there to do. They're there to take the inputs and convert them into outputs. So outputs are the accomplishments. That's what the business has achieved. In most organizations, accomplishments can be categorized into 3 groups. We can look at them in terms of investment returns, so the outcome of the business when it makes products and sells the products on the market, gets a revenue, pays its overheads, pays its direct labor, pays for all of the operating costs of the business. It's getting a return on its investment. So look at the amount of resources that was put into the business at the start and see what return has been given back to that investment. And that has an opportunity cost. Investment has an opportunity cost. The people who put in resources to start the business in the first place, they could have put their money into something else, but they choose not to. So what they could have got must be borne in mind. So if the business gives them a return of, let's say, 6%, but they could have got 7% in the bank, let's assume, then putting their money, their resources into this business was a bad decision. Starting the business was a bad decision. They could have got a better return elsewhere. So it's important that investment returns are worked out, because these are measures of the extent to which the investment in the first place was a good idea. We can also measure accomplishments in terms of customer satisfaction. We get feedback from the customers and we know how the customers feel about the product. And customer satisfaction will be a function of their perceptions of the quality of the product and the price of the product, the after-sales support that the product receives. All of the issues that are, in a sense, dealt with by the marketing department. And if the marketing department has read the requirements of customer requirements correctly, then the customers should be satisfied. And that looks good in terms of the continuation of the business. It looks good in terms of the likely future profitability of the business. So having good customer satisfaction is an output dimension. And there are also social impacts. The business itself works and operates in the community. It doesn't operate in a vacuum. So it's important that the business is seen as sharing the concerns of the community and working in a way which is compatible with the requirements of the community in terms of, let's say, pollution, noise, congestion on the roads, even the aesthetics of the company itself, what the company looks like, what the buildings look like. Are they, in a sense, compatible with the surrounding areas? So there is a social dimension as well. Now let's look at output measures. Well, we'll do it under these headings. We'll look at the category, the measurement concept, the performance measure, and the performance goal. So the performance goal is just simply changes of specific amounts over specific time frames. So it's the performance goal, what it wants to achieve. So let's take one to see how it works. Let's say investment returns. Now that's the category. We're going to look at this output measure for the business, and we're going to look specifically at investment returns. Well, the concept measurement here would be financial returns. I mean, if we're going to work out the investment returns, presumably we're working in the context of, if you like, we're working in the context of money. So we're going to deal with financial issues. We're going to look at the returns on the investment. Now, this is quite complex. We've only got as far as the second column here, but it is getting quite complex because when we talk about investment returns, it depends on the degree of aggregation. We could talk about the investment return for the whole business, and surprisingly enough, that's probably the easiest one to work out. We simply take the net profits of the business, let's say, and divide it by the amount that was invested originally, which gives us a very crude indicator of the investment return. Well, we could instead look at the investment return on a particular machine. Now that is far more complex to work out because we have to work out the output of the machine, but the machine is operated within the business, so there are overhead costs to be taken into account and labor costs and so on. So that is complex. The easiest one to do is the overall business. So looking at individual items, capital items, looking at the return on those is complicated. As I said just a moment ago, we have to take into account the contribution of other factors of production. Machines have workers with them, and what's the contribution of the machine? What's the contribution of the worker? and so on. So we're looking at financial returns. We've already hit a problem and we've only got as far as the second column. Now let's look at the performance measure. Well, we could look at the percentage return on investment, the percentage return on assets employed, the profit margin on sales. We have to decide exactly what we're trying to measure. We have to identify a particular measure and we have to be consistent then. Once we've identified it, if we're going to use it over time, clearly we'd stick to the same measure. Otherwise we'll not get comparability over time. So we need to work out what we're trying to determine here. We need to decide on a performance measure and then in a sense stick with it. And then we have to have a performance goal. We should perhaps have a statement like all of these measures, if you like, all should increase by a specific percentage change to be accomplished by a specific date. So let's say we have we work out the return on investment for the business, and let's say we find the return on the investment is 5%, just for argument's sake. Then the performance goal, we should say, well, that 5% should grow by another 5% or 10%, so it should grow to 5.5% in the next year. So we're setting a performance goal. We're saying that the performance of the business should increase by 10% in the next year. So therefore, our return on investment will not be 5% next year. It will be 5.5%. It will have grown by 10%. So we need to set performance goals. In setting the performance goal, of course, we must be realistic. We can't just set it because it was a good idea or we felt the figures were nice round figures. It should mean something. We could also look at investment returns. We could look at market share. We could look at the percentage market share relative to the competition. So how big is the company? How much of the market does it control? How does it fare compared to its competitors? Look at the market share relative to the total market size. How big is the market share compared to the total market? The performance goal here could be to look at the proportion of the market share against the competition and see to what extent that should increase over a particular time period. So again, it's setting out a performance goal. It should say the market share is currently, let's say, 20% of the market. Let's try and grow that to 22% in the next year, or 25%, and then sort of set about getting strategies to enable it to do so. Now let's move to step 3. Develop input measures for each goal. So now it's trying to find ways in which input measures can be assessed for each goal. Generally, develop input measures after having developed the output measures. We need to know where we're going before we can look at the input measures. We need to know what the objectives of the business are. We need to know the direction it wants to move in. If we don't know that, there's no point in developing input measures. Inputs, in a sense, are determined by the output requirements. Look at the financial operating resources of the business and see what the resources are. Look at the funds available. Look at whether the outputs that have been decided are feasible given the available resource packages, the cash, the machinery, the spare time, the store's capacity. Look at all of the resources available, but also look at the financial operating resources to make sure that the business can survive for the coming time period whilst attempting to achieve its set objectives. So make sure it can pay the bills. Look at the financial capital resources. Look at the amounts available for investment in perhaps new machinery or in new physical buildings, or look at the financial capital resources to hold additional stocks in the stores or to develop the business in some particular way. Are the financial capital resources available? If they're not, there's no point in planning ahead to have output growth or development as set out in the output section of this analysis. If the resources are not available, then the planning will come to nothing. Nothing will be achieved. Look at the other organizational resources that are required. Adjustments in, for example, office space. The organizational resources can be any part of the business, really. It can be the store's capacity, the size of the stores. However, that may come under capital. It could be the office equipment, not just the office space. It could be the design of the buildings and the efficiency with which the buildings are operated. So it could have an impact, for example, on energy conservation and the energy bills. There are many aspects to it, and it depends critically on the nature of the product and the nature of the business and its location and its particular features. Now, input measures for unit cost efficiency. Now, we're trying to get unit cost efficiency, so let's look at the input measures for the unit cost efficiency. And we'll do this under these headings again: category, measurement concept, performance measure, and performance goal. So we have financial operating resources. It's what we have at our disposal, I should say, perhaps, to achieve particular goals. So it's the operating resources of the business. And we would start by looking at materials and labour. And if we run across here, the materials and labour, of course, come under the financial operating resources because materials and labour must be paid for. And the performance measure is perhaps direct materials and labour per unit expressed in both monetary and quantity terms. So we're looking at the utilization of labour and materials. And that might be the basis for a measurement. How much labour was used in the production of a particular item, say last year, how much is estimated will be used next year. Perhaps the technology has changed. Perhaps the new machines that are being purchased will alter the ratio of labour to capital. And the performance goal could be a decline in materials and labour costs over a set period. Well, that's what the business is looking for. The business is looking for efficiencies. So the performance goal could be to reduce the material and labour costs over a period of time. Now for overheads, well, the overheads are, let's say, charged per unit of output. But then you'd have to look at the percentage utilization of the capacity. Are all of the overheads being used? Or sometimes in organizations, in companies, part of the buildings are not used or not being utilized. Sometimes when companies acquire premises, they have to acquire the whole premise, the whole set of premises. They can't pick just one part because it was sold as a unit. So some parts of the the business may not be utilized. So look at the average overhead cost and look to see if the average overhead cost can decline. And even if it's possible, look at the percentage capacity utilized and see if it can be changed around, or if the structure of the business, internal structure of the business, can be changed so that there's a more logical flow of production throughout the system, more fully utilizing all of the spare capacity. But it's trying to optimize on the resource that's available. The capital resources of the business, the financial capital resources of the business, well, this involves capital investment in operating assets, say capital investment in new machines. Well, the performance measure is the capital investment per unit produced, how much capital is involved in the production of a unit. Clearly, these figures are difficult to calculate, and most small, medium-sized businesses will not even attempt to calculate these. The calculation itself would absorb too much resource. But for larger companies who can employ specialists, for example, management accountants, they have got particular skills in measuring the contribution of capital as a proportion of the total output, or labour as a proportion of the total output, or overheads as a proportion of the total output, and so on. So they may be able to get a fix on the amount of capital per unit produced. How much machine time, how much of the overheads, how much of the floor area, and so on, have been absorbed into the unit. And in setting the price of the unit, it must cover all of those costs. The performance goal may be an average cost of capital employed should decline over time as capital resources are used more efficiently. Well, that's very similar to the utilization of labour or any other resource. The business is looking for efficiencies, and therefore they are trying to reduce the impact of the capital in terms of the costs of the product. They're trying to reduce the impact of capital by more fully utilizing the resource, getting greater numbers through the resource. So if it's a machine, if that's the resource, then if the machine's producing one, then that one item must carry the cost of the machine. If it's producing two, then each item produced will only carry half the cost of the machine. If it's producing 1,000,000, it'll carry a very small proportion of the cost of the machine. So it's trying to optimize the flow of materials through the machine. It's trying to optimize the use of the machine to try and reduce its impact. In other words, better use of financial capital resources. There are other organizational resources that should be taken into account. Non-financial resources consumed by the performance areas. There are many resources that are absorbed, which within the business, some of them are difficult to work out. As I said, floor space may be one, or the positions of production in terms of daylight. If it's a well ventilated, well lit capacity, well lit and well ventilated plant, for example, then perhaps that should be taken into account. It's a resource of the business. It's pleasant for the workers, and it leads to greater motivation and more application to doing the job. It's a non-financial resource. It's just it enables production to occur more efficiently, and there's more continuity in production. It's difficult to assess what these other organizational resources are. They would depend critically on the nature of the product, the type of company and the structure of the company that's been set up. By structure here, I mean the production structure, the layout of the plant and the layout of the machines. What is important is that whatever resources are required, other organizational resources, as I said, perhaps for ventilation or for heating or for whatever the resources that are used, they should be effectively costed, and over a period of time their impact on the accounts should be reduced as the volume of production is increased. Now, looking at the table, and it looks complex, but essentially if we go down the right hand side, down the performance goal, it all seems to come down to the same thing, to increasing production so as to reduce the impact of the financial operating resources, the capital resources, and the other organizational resources. To reduce their impact it's necessary to increase the output. That's what seems to come out of this table. It's difficult to do a very definitive table. We need to look at a particular company and trying to fill out particular inputs, and then look at the outputs associated with them and look at their performance goals, look at how they can be achieved and so on. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. It should happen. Business should look at their resources, look at how the resources are utilized, and try to minimize the impact of the resource in terms of the output value of the product. And it minimizes it by having greater productive capacity, by producing more. Sometimes if the markets are not growing, or if the product is in the later stages of its product life cycle, this may not be achievable. It may not be possible to increase production and thereby get the efficiencies that we're talking about here. So this whole analysis really hinges on the ability of the organization to produce more because it can sell more. But if the market is in decline, it can't do that. Or if the competitors are being particularly innovative and developing new products and having a more aggressive stance in the market, the company may find it difficult as well. So sometimes being very analytical, like this table suggests, is not possible. But having said all of that, it's still important that management tries to set performance goals, that management attempt to become more efficient. And the way to become more efficient is to break down the various activities of the business and look at each one individually and try to make each one more efficient. Because as each particular process becomes more efficient, the overall business becomes more efficient. The final step here is use an effective recognition system. We're still talking about measuring performance, so use an effective recognition system. Use measurement to initiate change. An effective measurement system will use the measured results as a management tool. That's why the businesses take measurements, so that they can use it as a management tool. There's no point in taking measurements and just forgetting about them, taking the measurements and filing them away somewhere. The measurements are taken so that they can be used, and they can be used by management to make decisions. And the results should have automatic intervention strategies built in. If the results are really bad from some particular aspect of the business, when the measurements are taken, the results are very bad, that should trigger intervention. It should be automatic. It should call the management into play. The management should get involved to try and look at what went wrong in that particular section. So it's important that measurements are used, and measurements call into play actions which will fix any adverse deviation or any underperformance. When results are as expected, we should offer congratulations and reinforcement to keep it going. Uh, Generally speaking, people achieve the results. It's people who achieve the results, and they should be congratulated, and that will enable them to be fired up and more motivated, and it'll enable them to more effectively work because they feel recognized and they feel a part of the organization and their contribution has been recognized. And that's important. People are people. When the results are less than expected, we should quickly isolate the cause and correct the process. So when the results are less, management, as I said earlier, should get involved and should look at the process and try to fix it. And the chances are the line operators who are involved will also appreciate that intervention because it flags up that their particular tasks are important. They got the management involved, but their tasks are important and they feel valued as a consequence. They've been recognised. Even though the results were adverse, management were involved with them and they will make contributions which are constructive to try and get the problem solved. It's in their interest to do so. I mean, it is their jobs and it is their livelihoods. Step 5 is a brief one. Step 5 is look at good systems and the requirements of good systems, which are they need good people. Good people mean people who are applied to completing the task efficiently, people who are not wasteful, people who will work honestly and do their best to achieve a good outcome. Improvement doesn't always take place on paper. Sometimes the improvements, we have to work through the problems and the issues and see what happens in practice. Sometimes when we design systems and look at systems on paper, we have an idea of optimality, we have an idea of efficiency, and on paper, of course, we can have a flow chart and it looks very straightforward and very streamlined. But when we do it in practice, issues that perhaps were unanticipated will arise. So doing it in practice is a lot more complex than doing it on paper. So it's the improvements that we expect from systems when we implement change are not always the ones that we get. Sometimes we could get additional improvements, ones we didn't anticipate, or sometimes we get under improvement because we were too optimistic in our calculations. So it's important that we have an indication off the paper as to what to do and the likely results. But as far as possible, it should be modelled or perhaps even implemented to see what the actual changes will be. Generally speaking, improvements happen when people are involved and the people are enthusiastic and they've got dedication and commitment and there's good morale amongst the workers and they know who the leader is and they have a clear set of objectives and they know precisely what's required of them and they've got the right resources. Under these circumstances, generally speaking, improvements can happen. And it's important that the organization deploy these resources in a way that's efficient and meaningful. In other words, the workers can see the logic in what is required and the resources are appropriate for the tasks that are ahead. So don't ask the workers to achieve outcomes if they haven't been given the right resources or they haven't been enabled to do that. So a good system on paper is a good beginning, and it could be carefully looked at by many parts of the management and the line operators and the line management, and criticisms could be fed back and refinements can be suggested, and the plan on paper can be refined over a period of time. But once a good system has been finally developed, it needs to incorporate people. And it's important to recognize that people are not machines. People have got their own requirements. They are sentient humans. They are thinking people. They have emotional needs. They will be away ill some days because they don't feel that well, and some days they'll be very enthusiastic, and other days they'll have issues on their minds which are not perhaps even related to work, but which will affect their work performance. But that's part and parcel of working with people. So a good system will, in a sense, incorporate the ups and downs associated with the people who will implement the system and manage the system as well. So in this session, what we've looked at is trying to measure performance, and we broke it up into 5 steps. The last step is just a brief step, really into about 4 steps. And we've looked at different approaches to measurement. The one thing that we should come away with from this exercise is that it is complex, and to some extent it can be very self-absorbing. It is looking at trying to improve the performance of an organization and trying to take measurements, but it should really take a very wide view, and perhaps the view that we've taken here, looking at, for example, the optimum use of financial resources, whilst desirable, it is only part of the picture. As I said earlier, where in the product life cycle is this particular product, and is the business anticipating perhaps sales which simply are not realistic given the stage in the product life cycle that is currently being experienced by the product in the market. Customers are turning away from the product. New products are coming out and being more acceptable to the customers, meeting the customers' requirements more precisely. So although we're using measures, it's important that the measures should be as wide as possible, and detailed measurements perhaps are what's good for management and enabling management to intervene as appropriate. Very detailed, complicated calculations are perhaps not that advisable for small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses. They absorb too much resource, and the return on that sort of measurement does not justify the expenditure. So it depends critically on the size of the business, the nature of the business, the product produced, the orientation of the management, and the desirability to measure, I suppose, overall. That's all we're going to do in this session. To leave it at that and say thank you for watching.